Jesus is the answer for the world today. Above him there's no other, 'cause Jesus is the way.
As you get more into your counseling center, you're going to run into these interesting issues. I'll call them technical issues no one ever told you about, and you really don't have any answers to, and you really don't know exactly how to handle those particular things. So today I'm going to try and share some of the answers to those things. As an example, on the first run, we're going to start talking about online counseling. Now, why are we talking about online counseling? Just because it's coming up more and more. And you're going to run into that too sometimes, because why? Somebody's going to say, well, I'm out of town, but could I just come up on Skype? And could we do it that way? Or another particular case that I had, the person's fiance was in the Philippines. And they were here in the United States in a different state, and they wanted me to counsel them. So that one ended up being over the phone with somebody in the Philippines and somebody here. So all these interesting things come up, but then you say, but can I do this? Is this legal? And that's a real question, because a lot of the things in these areas we'll be talking about aren't really defined. And because they're not defined, you're going to have more questions. And so in a lot of these cases, I had to dig into them and figure it out. And so I'm going to pass on to you what I know about these subjects. So the first thing is online counseling. And this is becoming more and more important. And there are actually whole groups of Christians that have put systems together where you can join their system, and they'll provide you all the structure to do the online counseling. But what do you really need? Skype, which is free. You just download it, and they can get on Skype, and you get yourself a little camera if you don't have one on your computer already, and you can do online counseling. I'll give you my prejudice. Phone counseling is a lot harder. Skype counseling is a lot better, because at least you get a certain amount of feedback from what the person is looking like and what they're doing. But you also get interesting asides. Like in this one particular case, you could tell that the person that we were trying to do counseling with was watching TV at the same time, was eating their meal, and somebody knocked on their door. So you don't have exactly the same amount of control over your situation and what is going on as you're counseling people. But that's information, isn't it? It tells you maybe how interested they are in your session at that particular point. So normally people will do it over the phone, but Skype has really come and become a very important type of thing, and it is really a national trend. But there's all these unresolved legal things, like you have to be licensed in your state. What if you're in your state and you're licensed there and they are in a different state? Or what if they are on a vacation? What if you don't even know where they're at? Because you can do Skype from any place. Will the insurance, if you're taking insurance, pay for online counseling? In a lot of cases, they won't. How about ethical codes? A lot of the ethical codes are now trying to write something into their code about this subject, but the majority of them don't have anything in their codes about being ethical in online counseling. It's happening all the time. I just brought up on the computer online counseling and got thousands of different organizations doing online counseling, but it's not really very defined for you. How about the liability in online counseling? How do you validate the information? How do you know you're even really talking to the right person? Or they gave you any information? Because what's one of the reasons that people like online counseling? Because they don't have to give you a lot of information. They can be totally anonymous. Think about this particular case. You're dealing with a person online. They gave you supposedly some information, and they start talking that they are a acting out pedophile in the children that they are abusing. Now what do? Well, what you're probably going to find out is what? They didn't give you valid information, and you have no way of tracking them. So now how are you going to carry out your responsibilities in this area? Duty to warn. Do you really know their legal name, their address, their location? Could you even get a hold of the authorities of wherever this is? Can you predict what the client is really going to do when all you're doing is seeing an image of them in your face? What if you don't know the person they're thinking of killing? How are you going to get a hold of them and carry out these requirements? How are you going to get them to the nearest emergency room if they're suicidal? If you don't even know for sure who they really are and where they're at. So can you see the big gaps that we have in these areas of how to resolve those things? Do you know the laws of the state or even the country in which they might be when you are counseling them? So what are the advantages? First, location, that you can get a hold of people. How about people that are shut in and can't leave their house? How about people that have to travel hundreds of miles? So we've had situations here of people that were driving 2 hours to get to our counseling. Wouldn't it be better to be able to just counsel them directly? I've actually had some people that only were about a half hour away, didn't have gas money, so they wanted to do Skype counseling. So the advantage is you don't have to travel to the place, don't have to provide the child care. How about in correctional facilities, if they would allow that? Usually they're not going to allow that, by the way. Geriatric populations. Could it be set up actually at a nursing home that you could be working with somebody directly there? Disadvantages, I already mentioned some of them. Insurance does not cover it. Technology problems. This one person that I was counseling, they would drop out because their electricity went out in that particular country. Computer dropout. Your computer connection is not good enough. It depends on how fast their video is and how good your camera is to what you really see. How about privileged communication? One thing you might not realize about privileged communication is the fact that if it is publicly disclosed, you no longer have privileged communication. Well, if something goes over the internet, is it publicly disclosed? You would think so, and you don't know. How about confidentiality? How confidential is the internet, and how are you going to keep other people from identifying who this person is? Because they can probably track their computer if somebody really wanted to. So how confidential are your sessions? See all the interesting stuff? Malpractice. How are they going to enforce malpractice if they have a problem with what you're doing? We already said the therapist has a very hard time responding to a crisis. It's a little bit harder to go all the way to New York and take care of something if they have a problem. It's not appropriate for serious mental illness. Why is that? Because you're going to have a lot more crises, a lot more problems, and they need to relate. And see, there's something about transference and countertransference and all that stuff in counseling. How effective do you think that is probably over the telephone or over Skype? You don't have all the physical or emotional cues. Body language. This one person, the background was so dark there you could barely sort of make out their face. So it's hard to really know what's going on there. They have a tendency to look at the screen rather than to look in eye contact, right? Because their camera is sitting up over here, they're watching you on the screen, so are you seeing their eye contact? Not necessarily. Decreases spontaneity in expressing of emotions. It's just easier to not really get into the thing if you're just sitting there looking at a computer. Good things are, there's been very good success using this, especially for depression, anxiety, addictions, that kind of stuff. So what kind of answers can I give you? First, cover yourself with an online informed consent explaining the problems, the rules, and the expectations. Because at least you've covered yourself. They know that what's going on here is not really confidential, that other people could get all the information, could watch it, and so on and so forth. And if they want to make that choice, that is up to them. And you can explain that if you were hoping to have privileged communication, the courts probably are going to rule against that. Another way to get around it, if you're dealing with couples like I normally deal with, one of them is sitting in the session with me, so they've already agreed to everything. But I would still want to have, if possible, another form for the person that is joining in on that particular session. But the main thing I want to point out to you is the things you need to think about if you get involved in that, and you're going to get requests of people that want to do that. Next thing we need to talk about is Facebook. I've already mentioned about Facebook and the fact that it can be used very good as an advertising media. But what do you think the problem could be in Facebook? How about dual relationships? Did you ever think about on Facebook? I think I asked you last time about how many friends you have. Well, do you counsel your friends? So how do you sort that whole thing out? What can you do, what can you not do, so that you are not creating an ethical violation by accepting people that are your friends? And if you're up there, guess what's going to happen? Some of your clients are going to ask you with friend requests. What are you going to do? What do you do if somebody is on your Facebook as friends and now you start counseling them? Do you unfriend them? How do you sort this all out? The Zira Institute actually has done a very good study of this whole thing and sorting it out, and gives us very good guidelines of what to do and what not to do. And what it comes down to is, depending on how you handle it, you could be in violation or you would not be in violation. What's the problem on dual relationships? Somebody can't be one of your friends of your family on one hand and you counseling them on the other hand. And that can cause major, major problems in the way they see things. Like in my particular case, and of course in a lot of your counseling in the church, you're going to have people that are church members at least, or they may even be a member of your congregation, and you're a counselor too. Does that cause you any problems? Well, I had this particular man, and he was dealing with some schizophrenia and some other issues like that, so I was providing him quite a bit of counseling. In the middle of one of my sermons, he stands up and wants to deal with one of his counseling issues. What do I do then? Well, I have to ask him, as the pastor with the hat I'm wearing right then, to please sit down and I'll talk to him after the session. He felt very rejected and relapsed. Do you see the problem, the dual relationship things? Well, in the same way, if you unfriend this person who you're now counseling, they might not take that too well. So what are some of the answers? Well, it really depends on the kind of client information that you're allowing the person to be privy to. And it's the nature of the therapist-client online interaction that you're dealing with. If the therapist profile, now what's the profile? That is the information you put on there, and if you make that very professional and you don't put on any of the private information about your family, and you would think that would solve the problem, right? But what if these other people start putting their personal stuff on, or your kids put their personal stuff on your wall? Then where are you going? So you're not just totally in control of all the information, but the first step is make your site a professional site, and if you have to, you can actually set it up so certain people can see certain parts of the site and other people can see other parts. Now, it's frowned on to have two different sites, but that could be a way too, that you have your sort of personal one and you only accept certain friends to that. But Facebook doesn't like that, having two different sites, because it causes a lot of confusion. But you can, if you get good at it, use those different restrictions of who can see what on your site, and that can help. That's called segmented lists. This particular list over here can see this information. This list over here can see this information. The problem is to make sure you don't get information on there that is going to cause problems and cause the perception of a dual relationship. because that's what it comes down to. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, it's their perception of how they see this whole thing. If they think I'm one of his best friends because they're on Facebook, that could affect your overall counseling, and you're going to have to use good judgment on those kind of things. Would the client be able to easily process the emotional and psychological aspect of the dual relationship? Is the client a highly functioning fellow professional or very disturbed person? Does the client need clear limits, or can he or she benefit from a more flexible approach? So you're going to have to judge this almost on an individual basis, and you might have to have a discussion with this client and say, well, the reason I don't want you on my website at this point is that we're dealing with some really deep issues, and I don't want you to be confused. So you could do that on an individual basis. But it is very confusing, because generally you're going to have all these friends of the friends of the friends asking you all this stuff, and a lot of them are going to end up being past clients and other things like that. A profile that is strictly professional may be viewed differently from a highly personal profile with family pictures, vacation videos, people that you've dated, and other personal things. How personal do some people get on Facebook? Extremely personal. See, that's what you cannot do, okay? You cannot go on there as a counselor and pretty much spill your guts to the whole world. You shouldn't be doing that anyway, would you agree? Not from a professional standpoint, because who knows who's going to get a hold of it on the internet, even if they're not there as friends. Does the client tend to push boundaries? Is making the link between the therapist and the client public a way to take healthy ownership of the connection? Is she or he seeking more meaningful connection with the therapist? What's the reason? Intensive or psychodynamic type of counseling is different, and probably you shouldn't have them as friends for that type of counseling, and that's why. Because of the interaction that you have, the transference, the counter-transference type situation. Ultimately, the most important question is, how might the therapist's response to a friend request affect the treatment and the therapeutic relationship? So it comes down to, you can have your site, and almost everybody does. Just keep it as professional as you can. Try to help people understand not to put too much really personal stuff on there. And if there's a problem, you're going to have to deal with it in your session, if you choose to do that. Of course, you could not use Facebook at all, and then you don't have that problem, right? Another huge area that we need to talk about, and it's called supervision. Now, what's supervision all about? Well, even if you're a Christian counselor and you got your degree and you apply to get liability insurance, many times they're going to require you to be under supervision for a certain period of time. And especially if you are now getting your license by the state, they're going to require you to be supervision for a long period of time, and they're going to have all these rules and all these regulations that have to do with supervision. Now, even if they don't apply to you, you still need to really listen to this, because who really sets the standards? What are the expectations? The secular world and the state, and what the laws say and what the regulations say about supervision. So what I've done is pulled out information about supervision from my own field, which is marriage and family therapy, state of Kansas. And we're just going to go through, and you're going to see what's required for doing what they consider to be adequate supervision. Now, if you don't have any of that and you're operating out of a church, you still really need to be under supervision of your pastor. So you have someone over you. You're not just loose cannon bouncing all over the place and doing things. You need somebody that has authority over you and over what you're doing. So you're just not out there all by yourself. Of course, how much paperwork do you think is involved in this? Tons, right? Okay, let's look at what the state of Kansas requires for a licensed marriage and family therapist. The first thing is they have to have 4,000 hours of professional experience which includes 1,500 hours of direct client contact. Compare that to how much we require in our programs here. Okay, so there's a big difference here. You have to have at least 50 hours of one-on-one supervision. How much do we require here? 10. At least 100 hours of clinical supervision with a supervisor with no more than 6 supervisees. And normally, if you're in this particular deal, you're either paying somebody to do your supervision or you're working for them. That's the way it works. At least 1 hour of clinical supervision for every 15 hours of direct client contact within a given week. So if you would have more than 15 client hours, then you need more than 1 hour even per week. At least 2 separate clinical supervision sessions per month. At least 1 has to be individual. Your clinical supervisor. In this state, the person has to be a licensed clinical marriage and family therapist and has to have at least 2 years experience under that license before they can supervise anybody. Now, there are whole organizations like the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapy that there's a whole level of training you go through to become an official clinical supervisor. But this state just requires 2 years of experience. If a marriage and family therapist is not available to supervise, then you can get somebody else in the behavioral sciences to take that place. They have to have professional authority over you and responsibility for the supervisor's clinical functioning. It can't be a dual relationship. Knowledge and experience has to be in the same population, the same particular area. They have to have an understanding of the setting. So if you're not really supervising this person directly, then you need to understand their setting. As an example, you would need a supervisor that is a marriage and family therapist that's a Christian in a Christian setting to understand the setting that you're in. That's what the requirement is. In other words, there has to be a good fit between what you're doing and the person that you're supervising if you're the supervisor in that particular thing. And they need to understand your staff setting and the whole organization that you're really dealing with there. You need this clinical supervision training plan. And that is a big stack of things that you need to do. You have to define the payment clearly of what's being paid for this. The clinical supervisor shall perform the following duties: oversight, guidance, and direction of the supervisee's clinical practice, distinct from personal therapy. It can't be somebody that you are just doing regular training or counseling with. It has to be a separate thing from that. It cannot be consultation. Documentation of supervisee's qualifications, periodically evaluate the supervisee's clinical functioning in accordance with the supervisee's training plan, maintain documentation, provide documentation to the board at the completion. So do you see how much stuff there is and how much is required for this overall thing? The level of supervision must be commensurate with the education training experience of both the supervisor and supervisee. Must ensure that each client knows that the supervisee is practicing under supervision. Each supervisor and supervisee shall develop and co-sign the written training plan. And there's all these requirements. I'm not going to go into all the requirements of the training plan. If you're in that situation, you can pull these up and make sure your training plan meets all of those requirements. And then the evaluation of the supervisee's progress under clinical supervision. The supervisee's informed consent for the supervision to discuss supervision or performance. What it's really saying is you need to tell the people that your clients that the person is going to be discussing your cases with the supervisor, and there may be other counselors in that meeting, and so on and so forth. That's included in our informed consent that we use here all the time. A statement signed by each supervisor or supervisee acknowledging that each person has read and agrees with all the requirements that are necessary. And what's the other thing to think about? You are coming under liability for the people you supervise, aren't you? Because if they would mess up or something, where are they going to go? Probably to you to say, well, why didn't you take care of this, this, and this? And you could get sued for what this person you're supervising does. So you need to really think about that. But do we need to be able to do that? Yes, if we want to have other people come into this field, especially into the Christian field, and with the requirements here saying your supervisor has to have the same kind of experience of the person that they're supervising, we need people in this particular field. And so we need to be able to help other people out. Obviously, within the Christian realm, all the requirements probably would not have to be fulfilled exactly that way, but you would still need to provide the help that is necessary to help people be the best counselors that they can possibly become. Another topic we haven't talked about, and that is insurance panels. Again, this really only applies to you if you're licensed by the state and you now can take insurance from the different insurance companies. But there are a few exceptions. As a pastoral counselor, there are certain insurance companies that will accept mental health insurance for going to a pastoral counselor. And you need to check into that. I know a particular man here in town that's a pastoral counselor that takes maybe 25 or 50% of the different insurances as a pastoral counselor. There are two ways to be in panels. The first way is an individual. That means that you're checked out by the panel and they accept you and you're doing everything just as an individual. The other one is as a group. And the problem is a lot of these panels, when they have enough counselors, are not going to be taking new counselors in their panel. But if you can get somebody that's in the group, they will allow you to join that group. So that's a way to get into some insurance panels that you can't get into otherwise. What are the advantages? If the person is what's called in-network, that means if you are in the panel, then they will pay more money for the counseling, and there will be less deductible and less copay for that particular client. So what's the client going to want? Somebody that is on that particular panel. I just had one this week again, that a person called and I had to say, I'm sorry, on that panel we're out of network. Said, well, do you know anyone in town that is? So I had to refer them to a different counseling center that I knew that was in network for that particular panel because it would save the person money. Of course, if you don't take the insurance at all, you can always offer them a cut rate based on the fact that you don't take their insurance, therefore it's my problem, not your problem, so I will just give you your counseling at a lower rate. Of course, what's the problem? When you get on a particular panel, they're going to want you to write off a certain amount of the payment that the client normally would be paying. And so you don't get as much money. And some of the panels, I'll have to warn you, pay almost nothing. The only reason we're on some of those panels is because we want to be able to help those particular clients. But one of those panels, as an example, we charge $100 for counseling. They pay $20.40. And they require the client to pay $25. So we're writing off more than half of the entire charge just to be on that panel. And on those panels, you can't charge more because they're not being paid. You have to write off the remainder. So you can see how, depending on which ones you take, this could really be a problem. But why would you want to take them anyway? Because many times that's where you're going to get your clients. Because they're on the list, so those people will come to you. So you have to trade all those things off. In one particular case, we dropped out of one particular network, but then we had people coming to us that desperately needed counseling. So we got back into the network, even though we don't make nearly as much money off those particular clients. Just to be in the network, just to be able to help those people. So you're going to have to balance out how much it's going to cost you and how much paperwork is it going to take. Now, how much paperwork does it take if you get in these panels? Well, the first thing is you're going to be putting out something at least an eighth an inch to a quarter inch thick of all the paperwork to get into the panel. And then once you get into the panel, you have outpatient treatment requests that many of them require. What's the problem with that? If you don't send in the request based on the number of sessions they approved, they won't pay for it and you have to write those sessions off and you get nothing for those particular sessions. Other panels would do this. They're going to give you those sessions only by certain codes. Like one of the panels, they will give us 4 90806s, that's individual counseling, and 4 90847s. Well, guess what happens if you have 5 90806s? They're not going to pay for the 5th one. So many times they save a lot of money if you don't have your act together and you don't do your paperwork right and you don't keep up on it, and especially if you don't have software that tracks all of this stuff. And then they can deny your treatment. And they can deny and they can ask for your records, to look at your records to determine if your treatment was necessary, because that is one of their criteria, is whether the treatment is necessary or not. And the ups and downs of these panels can be very interesting. We actually had a 2-year period with one of the major providers here, where we were in a major war with them because they were denying about everything. Another panel will not pay for anything that is a joint counseling. They will only pay for individual counseling. So how do you work around that? And so then if they deny it, what do you have to do? To write up appeals and send in these appeals which meet a particular board. And if that board denies it, then you get to put in another appeal. And sometimes the first board denied it based on one thing, and the next appeal you put in, they denied it based on a different thing. What kind of hint does that give you? So anytime we're looking at a panel, we first ask them, what do you pay for 90806? What do you pay for 90847? What do you pay for 90801? And then what percentage of the customary are we going to get, so at least we know what we're going to end up getting paid. You're going to have to sort that all out and decide if you want to be on these panels or not be on these panels, and how much paperwork you really want to do. One of the trends is if you're a very well-known, experienced counselor, you quit taking insurance. Because you have enough clients that are coming that don't take insurance, and you don't have to do all of this paperwork and do all of these kind of things and play all of these interesting games. But if you are applying to the panels, there's one thing that might help you. It's the Counseling on Affordable Quality Health Care, CAQH. And that is an overall organization nationwide. They have over 1 million different counselors that are on that particular thing, and what it means is you only have to put your information in once because you're already approved to be on panels. What are the panels around here in this particular area? Definity, Aetna, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Cigna, Coventry, Simpatico, Preferred Health or PPK, WPPA, and United Behavioral Health Care. And many times you have that insurance company, but then they will have another organization that actually does their mental health work, makes the approvals and all of that kind of stuff, and actually determines whether you're going to get paid for a particular client or not. So do you see how many panels there are and how much paperwork this could all take? But generally in our area, the Preferred Health and Blue Cross Blue Shield are the main panels, and therefore if you're in those, maybe 50 or more % of all clients will be in your network, and you'll be able to deal with them there. Testing. How many of you heard of psychological testing? Well, how much do we actually usually do here? Only what we need to do to really understand the client and what is going on. But there's certain things you need to know about psychological testing, just so that when people call you and ask you questions, let's say when you get into the real world here and you have your own center, you're going to get all these interesting calls and all this stuff, and if you don't understand the system, you're going to have to learn the system. And that's what we're trying to do, is give you the pieces you need to make this whole thing work out. It's primarily the psychologists that do the testing. As an example, my daughter, again, who's a clinical psychologist, spent all these courses and all these hours of doing testing. She actually did an entire practicum for an entire year just testing convert at a prison hospital. and running all these different tests. And so they're actually trained to run all these tests, and they're qualified to run all these tests. You're not, but you can get some of these tests as a professional to maybe help you out in particular areas. The main one that you're going to always get a call on probably is, can you do a psych eval? Now, what's a psych eval? That's a psychological evaluation for the courts. And when the courts have situations where they're wondering about people and they want to know if they're sane or not, they want to know if they have mental illness, they want to know if they have problems, they will ask for a psych eval. And that requires that you have a clinical psychologist go through certain different testing, usually in what's called an MMPI, Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or at least do an inventory and write up a bunch of information officially for the courts. Now, unless you want to study that and get into that, I recommend you don't get into that. You have somebody you can refer to in your area, some psychologist, to do psych evals and do those kind of things. The MMPI that I just mentioned is one test you probably really need to know because it's used by a lot of organizations. My daughter even had to take one to get into training as a psychologist. And a lot of different organizations will use that because it's sort of a broad brush personality thing that looks for certain patterns. That's pretty good. Another one you need to know about is the SASI, Substance Abuse Subtle Screening Inventory. Because you can get that and that can help you determine whether a person is dependent or non-dependent on particular addictions like drugs and alcohol, or primarily those two. Another one you're going to maybe be interested in this particular case, because we don't have enough clients, we just use a different organization to do this test for us if we need it. And this is for ADHD. It's called the TOVA. And it's the test of variable attention. And supposedly it finds about 78% of people that are normal and 80% of people that are ADHD, and it takes only about 22 and a half minutes on a computer. But you have to pay for it. You could have it yourself if you have enough clients that use this, or we had worked with another organization that has that test, and they just allow us to send our people over there, take the test, pay them, and we get the information back. So again, you can work out different ways that way. Prepare Enrich, we've mentioned before. And that's what we use for people in premarital or to try to evaluate marriages in a very quick form. Another one you need to know about is the Stanford Binet Intelligence Test. That's the IQ test. Average person has around 100 IQ. If it's lower than that, you're going to have someone that might be mentally retarded. And if you at least know those numbers, it gives you an idea of what those numbers might mean to you. So those are just a few of them. If you want to go on the internet, I found 250 different tests that are available out there that you could get, and as a professional you could possibly download and use. We use more like inventories out of different books and things like that to get a feel of where the client is coming from, rather than doing a lot of testing. But there are psychologists that just primarily only do testing. But testing is usually more for court cases and situations like that, or evaluations that have great ramifications. Now, we mentioned before some of the different forms, and I want to just point out from the forms book that we talked about, the Clinical Documentation Source Book by Donald Weiger. They have a mental health screening form, a substance abuse screening form, an adaptive functioning screening form, a learning disability screening form, and ADHD screening form. Now, why would you want those? So when somebody comes in without spending a lot of talking, you can just, okay, please take this. Let's see if we have a problem we need to look into here. Assessment forms: initial assessment, diagnostic interview, personal history, couple information form, emotional behavior assessment, diagnostic assessment, and biosocial report. All of those are forms already made up for you in that book. And then a psychological evaluation for adults, for children, psychological, vocational, and neuropsychometric consultation. And so those are just extra forms you can use to save yourself time to figure out what's going on in a particular case. And then finally today, I want to look at spiritual issues not otherwise covered. What I mean by that is there's certain things that you need to sort of sort out. We've covered them in different places, but again, for your center, I want to remind you of these particular things and what you might want to do in those particular areas. The first thing is, how do you determine the difference between a Christian center and a secular center? Because would you agree by now, as much as we've covered so far, that you realize there's a lot of difference in the rules? And wouldn't it be a problem if somebody evaluates you and sees you as a secular center and now tries to apply all those secular rules to your Christian counseling center? So how do you make it really clear to people of what you're actually doing? Well, the first thing is meet in a church, if you possibly can. That gives them a big hint that this probably is religious counseling that is going on, and it's probably your greatest safeguard. Another is use your Bible. One particular counselor puts a Bible right on their desk. Make it very clear, but use it. Have a Christian counseling degree. Advertise as a Christian counselor. As I said, in our particular advertisements, we put thoroughly Christian counseling. So they know they're not going to get secular counseling with a little bit of Christian talk mixed in. They're getting the entire thing. Place this information in your advised consent form. So it says right there, we are a Christian counseling center. We provide Bible-based Christian counseling. So there is not a question of what you're actually doing there. And pray in your session. Either before or after, or at least after your session, pray for your clients. That should also give them a fairly big hint. But the idea is it's so nebulous in between, you want to make it very clear what you're doing. How about leading people to Christ? My recommendation is using the 2 questions to start with to really find out where they're at, because nothing else seems to clarify the situation as much. If you died tonight, would you go to heaven? If you were standing at the gates of heaven and God asked you, why should he let you into his heaven, what would you say? And you're either going to get people that really know and say, because I'm trusting in Jesus Christ, or they're going to say, I'm not a bad person, or I'm okay, or it's based on my character, or other things like that. But there are a few other things you can do. You can then say, tell me about your experience when you got saved. And see if there's been a real change there. When they get saved, I recommend you have some booklets there. We have a little booklet about this new life. We have a little booklet that is the Gospel of John. So you have something to give them. Help them find a church. Check as you progress. Okay, how are you doing? Have you got into a church yet? How is God working in your life? Many times I'll give them an assignment to read the book of Luke and the book of Acts, because that was volume 1 and volume 2 of the same book when it was written, both by Luke. And that gives them sort of an overall picture of what's going on, because that could make the biggest difference in your counseling. Many times on the church thing, I'll say, well, what's your church background? You know, churches are a lot like cars. Everyone likes different ones. Would you like me to recommend some different churches here in town? Of course, sometimes what I find out, they're going totally the wrong direction. They're getting into a cult or other things like that. Of course, it's your choice, but let me just warn you that you could have this problem or this problem. We need to get you into a solid Christian church someplace here in town. Now, what we don't do is we don't invite them directly even to our own church. We say, you need to find out where God's alive and well and where you're going to fit in where God wants you to be, because we don't make the assumption that everyone is supposed to go to our church just because they came to our counseling center. And we'll even recommend them to other churches that might fit them better, so that this just really works. And of course, we explain to them that once you get into a church, you don't leave unless the Holy Spirit directly tells you you need to work out whatever issues you have. There are no perfect churches, especially if you're in it, right? How about biblical levels of counseling? You're going to have to decide that. Where is the balance going to be in your particular center? Is it a Christian counseling center simply because you're a Christian? I had that experience. That was the only reason. Everything was totally secular. Never mentioned Jesus at all. Is it basically secular, integrating a little bit of Christian in? Unfortunately, there's a lot of Christian counseling centers like that because they were primarily trained as secular counselors, and they are Christians, and so they add a little bit in. How about mostly biblically based? How about as much as possible biblically based? Everything in the Bible based on verses. And finally, totally led by the Spirit. You'll have to figure out that mix yourself and say, where am I really at and what do I want in my center? And you set up things that way. Do what God has called you to do. That's what this is all about. What do you do when a client comes in and says, I only want counseling directly from the Bible? You're going to get some of those, right? Well, what do? Well, you say, well, everything I'm doing is based on the Bible, and I'll try to bring up the Bible verses and show you how it's based on the Bible. And if you have any question about anything I say that is you think it might not be based on the Bible, then ask me and I'll show you how it's based on the Bible. But that's not the harder one. The harder one is when they come in and say, I don't want any Bible-based counseling. I don't want anything Christian. Will you counsel me from a totally secular direction? What do you say? I say, yes, that's your choice, but I want to let you know that you're tying my hands behind me, that I've got all these extra tools that I have from the Bible that could help you very significantly. But if you don't want me to use them, that's your choice. If you don't want me to pray in session, I'll allow that, but I'm going to be praying for you afterwards. And when you get to the place that maybe you do want to face whatever your struggle is here or your problem with God, I'll be willing to talk to you about that. As an example, I had a particular client come in exactly like that. After I got to know him, I found out the problem was he had been in an accident and lost his leg and was really blaming God and was really mad at God. In fact, the real issue he needed help with was his relationship with God. But he was so mad and felt that God had let him down, and that initially he was saying, I don't want anything to do with God. But eventually, as the sessions progressed, that's all we were talking about. But the idea is it's your job to fit in with them wherever they're coming from and however they're coming from that particular point. And your job is to help them the best you can at that particular point. Because you're going to get other people that come in. So you might get lesbians, you might get homosexuals, you might get addicts that have a particular thing. I don't want this because they've been hurt in a particular way. And the idea is, how can you help them to the degree that you can really help them? And you'll have to make that choice. If you feel they're asking for something you cannot do, you have to tell them, I'm sorry, I can't do that particular thing, but I can do this. How are we going to work this all out? How are we going to make this all work? So what are we talking about here? We're trying to help you to be fully equipped for all good works. So we're dealing with a lot of issues. It seems very complicated. We got all this stuff to learn and think through, but we have God on our side and He makes it all work. Let's pray. Lord God, we thank you that you are our God and that you are in charge and we can trust you completely. And Lord, we trust in you to lead us and guide us in Jesus' name. Amen.
Jesus is the answer for the world today. Above him there's no other, 'cause Jesus is the way. Jesus is the answer for the world today. Above him there's no other.